Megan Taylor had always believed her family was perfect. She had grown up in a warm home where her parents, John and Emily, were loving and attentive, and everything seemed in its place. She never imagined that anything could disrupt the seemingly flawless life she had. But one afternoon, everything changed. Returning home from school earlier than usual, she heard voices coming from the kitchen. It was her mother, Emily, and Thomas, the family friend who had always been around. Megan hadn't expected to see him there, and as she approached the kitchen, she felt a strange tension in the air. They were talking, but their words felt loaded with something unspoken, something hidden. Their glances met in ways Megan had never noticed before, as if there were something between them that didn't belong. Megan stood frozen in the doorway, unsure of what was happening, but the weight of it all pressed on her chest. She couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed, but she knew deep down that nothing would ever be the same again. The feeling of dread lingered, and she couldn't shake the suspicion that this moment would mark the beginning of something she could never undo. The more she tried to unravel the truth, the more painful the reality became. It was a warm evening in Tucson, Arizona, in 1998. The sun was setting behind the distant mountains, casting a golden hue over the city as it slowly gave way to the creeping twilight. The air was still heavy with the heat of the day, but the promise of cooler temperatures lingered in the breeze. Cars passed by along the quiet streets, their sounds drifting in and out of the evening air. The peaceful rhythm of suburban life settled over the neighborhood as the streetlights flickered on, casting dim pools of light across the houses. Megan Taylor had just returned home from school. She walked up the porch steps and entered the house, the familiar creak of the front door greeting her. Dropping her heavy school bag onto the couch, she sighed, her shoulders releasing the weight of the long day. It was the last week of school before the summer break, and the anticipation of freedom was palpable, though tinged with the usual dread of finals and last-minute assignments. Still, Megan felt relief wash over her as she stepped into the cool interior of the house, the familiar sense of home embracing her. The smell of roasted chicken wafted from the kitchen, mingling with the earthy notes of the furniture and the lingering aroma of fresh laundry. Megan walked into the kitchen where her mother, Emily, stood at the stove, stirring a pot. The rhythmic sound of the spoon against the metal echoed through the room. Emily looked up as she heard Megan's footsteps, her face lighting up with a warm smile. She wore her usual faded apron, the one she'd had for years, and her hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail. It was a simple evening, just like so many others. "Hey, Meg," Emily said softly. "How was school today?" Megan shrugged, pulling an apple from the bowl on the counter. She felt the weight of the day still pressing on her, though she didn't show it. "It was fine, just a lot of homework. Where's Dad?" Emily's smile faltered for a brief moment, but Megan didn't notice. She never did. Her mother's voice, always so steady, always so comforting, was filled with a slight edge of something unspoken. "He's still at work. He'll be home late tonight." Megan nodded and bit into her apple, the crisp sound of it cutting through the quiet atmosphere. She sat down at the kitchen table, her book already in front of her, ready to finish an assignment she'd been putting off. Emily turned back to the stove, her movements calm and practiced, as she continued to prepare dinner. The soft sizzle of the chicken in the oven and the low hum of the refrigerator were the only sounds filling the room, creating a comforting, almost predictable sense of normalcy. Megan flipped through the pages of her book absent-mindedly, lost in the familiar motions of the evening. She could feel the calmness of the house settling around her, the familiar rhythms of her family's routine. It was a simple moment, a quiet one, and Megan often took comfort in these small, ordinary pieces of life. The house felt like it always had, warm, safe, and stable. But then she heard a sound that pulled her from her thoughts, a car engine rumbling to a stop outside. Megan glanced up toward the window. Through the blinds, she could see a familiar figure getting out of a car, his tall frame moving toward the front door. It was Thomas Reed, the family friend who had been a constant presence in her life since she was little. She had grown used to him being around, especially when her father was at work. Thomas was often a quiet, steady presence, someone who made their home feel fuller, safer somehow. He was a kind man, always smiling, always willing to help out. But there was something about him today that made Megan pause. The door opened with a slight creak, and Thomas stepped inside. He gave Megan a warm, if somewhat strained, smile. "Hey, Meg. How's it going?" Megan smiled back, though she couldn't shake the odd feeling she had. "Hey, Tom. Everything's fine." He stood near the doorway for a moment, as if unsure of where to go, and then moved toward the kitchen, pausing just behind Emily. His smile, though genuine, didn't quite reach his eyes, and there was something in his posture that seemed different. Tense, maybe, or restless. Megan watched as he exchanged a glance with her mother, his eyes lingering just a moment longer than usual. It was subtle, but enough for Megan to notice. His movements were slower, more deliberate than she remembered. They were acting strangely, she thought. He lingered near the kitchen table for a moment, his hand brushing the back of a chair, then turned to Emily, speaking to her in soft tones that Megan couldn't quite hear. The conversation was low, the words barely audible over the hum of the stove. Their voices were quiet but carried a certain weight, a quiet intimacy that Megan hadn't noticed before. There was something in the way they exchanged looks that made her stomach tighten, something that felt out of place. It wasn't the usual camaraderie that Thomas had with her mother. This was different, though Megan couldn't quite put her finger on how or why. The air in the room felt heavier now. Megan's fingers tightened around the apple in her hand, though she hadn't realized she was holding it so tightly. She could feel the tension in the air, a subtle shift that seemed to hover just out of reach. It was as if something was hiding beneath the surface, just out of view. The ease of the family's nightly routine, the laughter, the normalcy, all seemed a little too forced now. Megan couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing, something she wasn't yet ready to see. She returned to her book, though her mind was elsewhere. The feeling of discomfort lingered, making the words on the pages blur together. What was going on? Why had Thomas been acting so differently? Megan knew there was something she wasn't being told, something that lurked just out of her grasp. But for now, she could only watch, observe, and wait. Days passed, and with each one, Megan could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere of the house. It wasn't something obvious at first, just a creeping discomfort that seemed to build with time. Her father, John Taylor, was home less and less, his long hours at the office stretching into the late evenings. He would come home exhausted, barely acknowledging the quiet dinners that Emily prepared for him. His presence was becoming a distant echo, a faint memory of the father who had once filled their home with laughter and warmth. Meanwhile, Emily and Thomas, the family friend who had always been around, seemed to be growing closer. Megan noticed how often Thomas stopped by the house now, sometimes unannounced, sometimes just to drop off something trivial like a tool, or to help Emily with odd jobs around the house. His visits had always been common, but now they were more frequent, more intentional. At first, Megan didn't think much of it. Thomas had always been a part of their lives, but soon it began to feel different. There was a tension in the air, something unspoken that made the house feel smaller, more suffocating. Emily, her mother, who had always been so open, so present, began to change. Her laughter, which had once filled the house with warmth, became quieter, more infrequent. She was distant, lost in her own thoughts. Megan would find her sitting at the kitchen table late at night, her hands resting on her coffee mug, staring blankly at the wall. It was as if her mother was no longer entirely present in the moments they shared. She would nod when Megan spoke to her, offering short, absent responses, her mind somewhere far away. Thomas, too, was different. He had always been warm and friendly, a man of few words but full of kindness. But recently, his smiles had seemed strained, his eyes distant, as if he were carrying some burden he wasn't willing to share. Megan noticed the way he and Emily would exchange looks when they thought no one was watching, their eyes lingering for just a second too long. The soft laughter they shared, the quiet moments spent together, felt uncomfortable, as though something deeper was happening beneath the surface. One afternoon, Megan came home earlier than usual, her school day ending unexpectedly early. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a car passing outside. She dropped her bag by the door, letting out a soft sigh of relief. It had been a long day, but she was grateful to be home. As she made her way to the kitchen, her mind still on her studies, she heard soft footsteps in the hallway. It was odd, she thought. It wasn't the usual sound of her mother moving around. These steps were slower, more deliberate, like someone trying to be quiet. She entered the kitchen, expecting to find her mother alone, perhaps preparing dinner or reading. Instead, she saw Emily and Thomas standing near the counter, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the kitchen light. They were talking, but their words were hushed, their voices low and intimate. Megan stood just outside the door, frozen for a moment, her heart suddenly racing. Something about the way they stood together, so close, so comfortable, sent a chill through her. Thomas was laughing at something her mother had said, but it wasn't the usual easy laughter she had always heard between them. It was strained, nervous, as though he was forcing it, trying to hide something behind that smile. Megan's eyes flicked from his face to Emily's. Her mother was smiling too, but it was different from the way she smiled at Megan. This smile was softer, almost secretive, and her gaze didn't meet Megan's. Instead, it drifted to the side as if avoiding eye contact. Megan's stomach twisted, a sudden unease settling over her. She had never seen them like this before. There had always been a natural warmth between Emily and Thomas, a friendship that was easy to see. But now, there was something hidden behind it, something Megan couldn't quite place. It felt wrong, as though she had stumbled upon something she wasn't supposed to see, something that had been kept carefully hidden just out of view. She didn't want to intrude, didn't want to make things awkward, but the feeling gnawed at her, persistent and growing. She told herself it was just her imagination, that maybe she was reading too much into things. But deep down, Megan knew that something was different. She could feel it in the air, in the way Emily's smile didn't quite reach her eyes, in the way Thomas's laugh seemed forced. The familiarity of her home, the security she had always felt here, suddenly felt fragile, like a house of cards waiting to collapse. That night, after dinner, Megan found herself lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts swirling around the strange scene she had witnessed in the kitchen. She couldn't shake the image of her mother and Thomas, standing too close, sharing a moment that felt too private, too intimate. What was going on between them? Why hadn't she noticed it before? It wasn't just that they were spending more time together. It was how they behaved, how their connection seemed to shift, becoming something Megan couldn't quite understand. She wanted to ignore it, to dismiss it as nothing. But the more she thought about it, the more questions piled up in her mind. Why was Emily acting so distant? Why did Thomas seem so nervous around her? And why did it feel like there was something more going on than she could see? Megan didn't want to confront her mother, not yet. She wasn't ready to face whatever this was, to risk breaking the fragile bond that still existed between them. But that feeling, the one that had started as a small spark of doubt, began to grow. It burned inside her, pushing her to find answers, to understand what was really happening. As the days passed, Megan found herself watching them more closely, listening to their conversations, trying to catch a glimpse of the truth hidden behind their words. It was the beginning of something she couldn't undo, the first inkling of the unraveling that was to come. The days stretched on, and the uneasy tension that had been quietly building in the house became unbearable for Megan. It gnawed at her, pulling her into a spiral of doubt and suspicion. She couldn't ignore it any longer. The way her mother's laughter was increasingly absent. The way Thomas lingered around their home, always finding a reason to be there. The soft, intimate glances they exchanged, the hushed voices in the kitchen. It all weighed on Megan's mind, a constant reminder of something that felt wrong but was just out of reach. Unable to contain the growing unease, Megan decided she had to find answers, no matter the cost. Her mind raced with possibilities, and each moment seemed to stretch, thick with uncertainty. She couldn't shake the feeling that her family was disintegrating around her, and she had to know why. One day when her mother had left for work, Megan's resolve hardened. She would search for the truth herself. She wandered through the house, her footsteps soft on the hardwood floors, as if the very air in the house was holding its breath. Megan's heart pounded in her chest as she approached her mother's bedroom. She knew it was wrong to go through her things, but the need to understand, to find something that explained the strange behavior, overwhelmed her. Her hands trembled as she opened the door to her mother's room, feeling like an intruder in her own home. The room was unchanged from the way it had always been, but it suddenly seemed different to Megan. She looked around, scanning the room for anything that could shed light on the mystery that had consumed her thoughts. Her eyes fell on a small wooden chest at the foot of the bed, one that had been tucked away for years, its contents unknown to Megan. She approached it hesitantly, her fingers brushing the dust off the lid before she opened it. Inside was a jumble of old letters, photographs, and forgotten mementos, pieces of a life she had never known. Megan's heart skipped a beat as she carefully sifted through the photographs. They were from a time long before Megan had ever been born. Images of her mother when she was young, full of life, surrounded by friends. And then, there it was, an image that caught her breath. Her mother, smiling warmly, stood next to Thomas. But it wasn't the smile of old friends or distant acquaintances. No, it was something more intimate, something more significant. Their faces were close, too close. Thomas's hand rested on her mother's shoulder in a way that made Megan's chest tighten. He looked at her mother not as a friend, but with something deeper, something that felt like it had been hidden for far too long. The photograph felt like a punch in the gut. Megan's vision blurred, and her breath became shallow as her heart raced. She turned the photo over, hoping for some explanation, but found nothing. Just more pictures, each one raising more questions than answers. The weight of it pressed on her, suffocating her as the realization settled in. There was something more between her mother and Thomas than Megan had ever imagined. A secret, a hidden connection that had been lying in wait, just beneath the surface. That night, Megan couldn't bring herself to sleep. She lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, the photograph burned into her mind. Her mother's words echoed in her ears. "We're just friends." But Megan knew better now. The photographs, the way Thomas had looked at her mother, the way her mother seemed to avoid her gaze. It all made sense in a way that Megan wasn't prepared to face. She couldn't pretend anymore. Megan knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. The truth was clawing at her, pushing her toward something she didn't want to confront. She had to talk to her mother, had to ask the question that had been tearing at her insides. But what if the answer was something she wasn't ready to hear? Megan didn't know. But she couldn't live in this uncertainty, this perpetual feeling of something being wrong. That evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, Megan's hands were clammy, her stomach twisted in knots. She could hear the clink of the silverware, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background, but all of it felt distant, muffled. Megan knew this was the moment, the point where everything would change. She looked at her mother across the table, who was eating in silence, her eyes downcast, her mind somewhere far away. Megan took a deep breath, her voice trembling but determined. She asked the question that had been burning in her mind. "Mom, what's going on between you and Thomas? Why are you two spending so much time together?" Emily froze. Her fork paused midair as she stared at her daughter, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. Then came the familiar attempt to mask the discomfort with a smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's nothing, Meg. We're just friends." But Megan saw through the lie. The hesitation, the flicker of panic in her mother's eyes. It was all there, laid bare. Megan didn't want to believe it, but she could feel the weight of the words that had been left unsaid. Emily's reassurance felt empty now, just another attempt to cover up the truth. The words no longer held the same comfort they once did. Megan's heart sank, the pain of betrayal mingling with a deep sense of confusion. How had she missed it all? How had she not seen what was so painfully clear now? She wanted to scream, to demand the truth. But instead, she sat there, silent, the weight of the revelation crashing down on her. She knew something had changed. Her family, the life she had once trusted, was no longer the same, and there was no going back. The following week felt like a slow descent into a world Megan didn't recognize. The moment she had confronted her mother, a shift had occurred, and she couldn't escape the overwhelming sense of alienation that had settled within her. Every interaction with her parents felt strained, as if they were speaking a language she no longer understood. Megan began retreating into herself, withdrawing from the once familiar routines that had once made her feel grounded. She would sit alone in her room for hours, staring out the window at the unchanging view of their quiet suburban street. The sounds of life outside muffled by the growing chasm inside her heart. She couldn't stand the way her father, John, continued to ignore the palpable tension in the house. His presence, once the anchor of their family, now seemed like a distant, unknowing figure. He was as consumed by his work as ever, returning late each night and leaving early in the morning. His oblivion to the changing dynamics within their family felt like an act of betrayal in itself. Megan had always relied on him for support, for stability. But now, he seemed to be drifting further away, unaware or unwilling to see the cracks that were forming around him. Megan could feel the anger rising within her, the hurt turning into something darker, something raw and uncontrollable. How could he not see? How could he remain so blind to the unraveling of their family, to the quiet, painful disintegration of everything she had known? It made her feel small, invisible. She wasn't sure what hurt more, the fact that her mother had betrayed her trust, or the fact that her father seemed to be complicit in this unspoken silence. Megan's feelings of betrayal were like an open wound that she didn't know how to close, and every passing day seemed to make it worse. Dinner became the most difficult part of the day. The once lively conversations at the table now felt forced, hollow. Megan's mother, Emily, would try to engage with her, but Megan couldn't bring herself to respond with anything other than short, clipped answers. She couldn't look her mother in the eye without feeling a surge of disgust and confusion. How could everything feel so wrong when, for so long, it had felt so right? How could Emily sit across from her, pretending nothing had changed? When Megan knew the truth? The picture in her mind of Thomas and her mother, so close, so intimate, was seared into her thoughts every time she glanced at her mother. Emily's attempts at normalcy were as transparent as glass, and Megan couldn't bear it. One evening, after dinner, John retreated to his study as he always did, absorbed in work. Megan watched him go, her anger bubbling just below the surface. This was it. This was the moment when she could no longer stay silent. She could no longer pretend that everything was fine. She needed answers, and she needed them now. As the door to her father's study clicked shut, Megan stood up from the table, her movements stiff and mechanical. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her chest, but she knew she couldn't go another day without confronting her mother. She walked down the hallway to her mother's bedroom, her mind racing with the words she had been holding inside for so long. The air in the house felt thick, suffocating, as if it too were holding its breath, waiting for what was about to unfold. Megan knocked on her mother's door before entering, her heart hammering in her chest. Emily was sitting on the edge of the bed, flipping through a magazine, but when she looked up and saw Megan standing there, her face fell. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of guilt, or perhaps fear, that Megan couldn't ignore. "Mom," Megan began, her voice strained but determined. "Did you fall in love with him? With Thomas?" The question hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Emily froze. For a moment, she said nothing, and Megan watched her mother's face drain of color. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. Megan's stomach churned as she saw the truth reflected in her mother's face. There was no denial, no reassurance, just a long, painful silence. "Megan," Emily finally whispered, her voice trembling, "it's not as simple as that." But it was too late for explanations. Megan had already crossed a line, already felt the weight of the betrayal in her chest. Her mother's words meant nothing now. The truth had already shattered the fragile illusion that had held their family together. Megan's anger erupted, her feelings spilling out in a torrent she couldn't control. She rushed into the room, her hands shaking as she struggled to contain the flood of emotions. "How could you?" she screamed, her voice raw with pain. "How could you do this to us? To Dad? To me? You've ruined everything. I trusted you." The words came out like a flood, each one more painful than the last. "You've destroyed our family. I don't even know who you are anymore. You and Thomas, how could you both lie to me, to all of us?" Her voice cracked as she spoke, the tears threatening to spill over. Emily stood there, speechless, her hands at her sides, looking as though she had been struck. Megan saw her mother's face change, the guilt and shame morphing into something more vulnerable. But it didn't matter anymore. The damage had been done. The love and trust Megan had once had for her mother felt like distant memories, fading with every passing second. Megan stood there, breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling with each sob that threatened to escape. The room was silent except for the sound of Megan's ragged breaths and the soft hum of the house around them. Emily remained standing there, motionless, unable to offer any comfort or explanation that would undo the harm she had caused. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Megan turned away, her back to her mother. She couldn't stay there any longer. The weight of the confrontation, the betrayal, was too much to bear. She didn't look back as she walked out of the room, her heart breaking with each step she took. She wanted to scream, to collapse, to make sense of everything, but she couldn't. All she could do was walk away, leaving behind the woman who had once been her everything, and the family that had once seemed so unbreakable. Megan couldn't bear to stay in the house for another moment. The walls seemed to close in on her, and every corner of the house felt like it was filled with betrayal. The argument with her mother had left her shaken, the raw emotions of anger and hurt swirling inside her like a storm she couldn't control. She packed a small bag, grabbed her phone, and left the house without a word. It was late, and the night air was cool as she stepped outside, the weight of the evening heavy on her shoulders. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to be away from everything for a while. The only place she could think of was her best friend's house. There, at least, she could escape the reality of her broken family. As Megan made her way through the empty streets, she tried to push her thoughts away, to focus on the quiet comfort that her friend's house could offer. But the ache in her chest remained, gnawing at her with every step. The night felt endless, the long hours stretching into what seemed like an eternity. She hadn't felt this alone in so long, and the thought of returning home filled her with dread. The small conversations with her mother that used to bring her comfort now felt like lies, empty words masking the truth that had been hidden from her. By the time morning arrived, Megan had spent most of the night tossing and turning on her friend's couch, unable to sleep, her mind a chaotic blur of emotions. The sounds of the world outside, the distant hum of cars, the soft chatter of birds in the morning light, seemed so far removed from the storm in her head. She knew she couldn't stay away forever. She had to face her mother. She had to find out what had really happened, what had been going on between her and Thomas. She had to know the truth, no matter how painful it was. When Megan returned home, the house seemed eerily quiet. It wasn't the usual bustle of family life, the sounds of people coming and going, or even the soft hum of the refrigerator. It was as if everything had come to a standstill, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Megan's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped inside, her nerves on edge. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew she had to confront her mother and get the answers she had been searching for. As she entered the kitchen, she saw her mother and Thomas sitting at the table, their heads bent close together in conversation. They looked up as she entered, their faces revealing nothing but the weight of silence. There was an awkwardness in the air, an unspoken tension that filled the room, and Megan could feel it pressing down on her. Her mother's face was pale, her eyes weary, as if she had been waiting for this moment. Thomas, too, seemed uncomfortable, his gaze shifting uneasily between the two of them. Megan stood there for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been dreading this moment, but now that it had come, there was no turning back. She couldn't hold the questions in any longer. The silence in the room was suffocating, and she couldn't stand it any longer. Her mother finally spoke, her voice softer than usual. She seemed tired, as though the weight of everything had finally caught up with her. "Megan, I know you have a lot of questions, and I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner." Her words hung in the air, heavy with regret. "Thomas and we've grown closer over the past few years. It wasn't something either of us expected, but it happened. It was a mistake, and it was wrong." Megan's stomach twisted as she listened, each word hitting her like a slap in the face. It wasn't a surprise, not anymore. But hearing the words aloud, hearing her mother admit it, was something else entirely. She had known, deep down, that something had changed. The way her mother had pulled away from her, the way Thomas had been a constant presence in their home. It was all connected. It wasn't just a casual friendship. It had been something more, something that had grown in the shadows, out of sight, until it had exploded into the truth Megan now faced. Megan's mind spun as she processed her mother's words. She had expected anger, expected to lash out, but instead, she felt a deep, aching sadness. Her mother had been struggling with something for so long, something she couldn't fix, and Megan had been blind to it. She had been too wrapped up in her own world to see the cracks in the foundation of their family. It hurt, but it also made sense in a way that nothing had before. "Why didn't you tell me?" Megan finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why did you hide it? All this time? You were just pretending everything was fine." Her mother's face crumpled, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Megan saw the woman who had raised her, the woman who had always been her rock, vulnerable and broken. "I didn't know how to tell you, Meg. I was scared of losing you, of losing everything. I didn't know how to fix it, how to make it right." The silence that followed was thick and heavy, and Megan felt the weight of her mother's words sinking into her chest. She had never expected to find herself here, in this place of heartbreak and loss. But as much as it hurt, she also knew that her mother had been trapped in her own way, trying to hold everything together, even if it meant sacrificing her own happiness. Megan took a deep breath, her eyes stinging with tears that she hadn't realized were there. She could feel the anger still simmering beneath the surface. But there was something else, something softer that began to take its place. It was the pain of the betrayal, yes, but it was also understanding. Understanding that her mother had made mistakes, that she had tried to hide them to protect Megan, and yet, in doing so, had only hurt her more. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," Megan said quietly, her voice breaking. "But I need time to think. I just need time." Her mother nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I understand, Meg. I'm sorry. I wish I could take it all back." Megan stood there for a moment, the weight of everything settling over her. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know how things would unfold from here. But she knew one thing for certain. Her family wasn't the same as it had been. It had changed, irrevocably. And though the pain was still there was also something else. Something that, for the first time, felt like the possibility of healing. Time passed slowly, and with each day, the weight of the past seemed to settle a little more in Megan's heart. The anger, the hurt, the confusion. It was all still there, lingering in the background, but it no longer consumed her. She had begun to accept that things could never be the same as they once were. Her family, the life she had known, was irrevocably changed. But as the days went by, Megan began to realize that it was not necessarily a bad thing. The truth, as painful as it was, had allowed her to see her family for what it really was, a complicated, imperfect unit. They were no longer the perfect, untouchable image she had clung to as a child. They were real, flawed people, struggling to hold on to one another in the face of life's unpredictable turns. Megan had spent weeks wrestling with the truth, with the shattered image of the family she had once adored. She had spent sleepless nights lying awake, wondering how to move forward, wondering if it was even possible to heal. The pain of betrayal still gnawed at her, but she understood now that love was not always perfect, that it didn't come without its scars. Her mother's confession, while deeply painful, had also been a moment of honesty. A rare thing that had allowed Megan to glimpse the vulnerability of the woman she had once thought was invincible. It had been the beginning of something, not an end. Despite the mistakes her mother had made, Megan knew that there was still love between them. The kind of love that had endured for years. The kind of love that had been tested by secrets and pain, but not destroyed. In her heart, Megan knew she could forgive, though forgiveness was not a quick or easy thing. It was a slow process, one that required time and space, and sometimes the courage to let go of the past. She didn't expect to feel whole again, not immediately, but the heaviness in her chest had begun to ease, replaced by a quiet acceptance that her family, like all families, was imperfect, but still worthy of love. One morning, Megan stepped out of the house, the sun shining brightly overhead. The streets of Tucson seemed quieter than usual, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. She had spent so many days cooped up inside, lost in her thoughts, that the world outside felt like a distant memory. But today was different. Today, the world didn't feel so overwhelming. The city, with its dusty roads and heat-laden air, felt familiar again, but it also felt new, as if it were offering her a chance to start fresh. She walked down the sidewalk, her steps steady, though there was still a sense of uncertainty in her heart. The weight of her family's struggles was not something she could easily forget, but she had come to understand that it was not something she needed to carry alone anymore. She had learned, over the past weeks, that healing didn't happen all at once. It was a journey, one that took time and patience, and she was finally ready to take that first step forward. As Megan wandered through the familiar streets, she felt something shift inside her. A quiet peace, a sense of acceptance. She no longer feared facing her feelings, no longer feared the reality of her situation. Her heart, once shattered and raw, had begun to mend in its own time. It wasn't the same as it had been before, but that didn't mean it was broken beyond repair. Megan had learned to forgive, not just her mother, but herself as well. The guilt that had once weighed her down was lifting, slowly but surely. She walked past familiar places, the small cafe where she used to stop with her father on weekends, the park where she and her mother had spent countless afternoons together, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the same ache. There was still sadness, still a quiet, lingering pain, but it wasn't the only thing that defined her anymore. She was not just the girl whose family had fallen apart. She was more than that. She was learning to rebuild herself piece by piece, and though the process was far from complete, Megan could feel a glimmer of hope inside her. The city around her seemed to mirror her transformation. The sun shone brightly, but the air was beginning to cool as the day went on. The streets that had once felt like a labyrinth of pain now seemed like a path forward, open and wide, ready to lead her somewhere new. Megan's steps were lighter now, less burdened by the weight of the past, though she knew it would always be a part of her. She could feel the change inside her, the shift from anger to understanding, from pain to healing. She wasn't the same person she had been when she first walked into that kitchen, confronting her mother with the truth. She was someone different now, someone who had learned that love, even when it was messy and imperfect, was still worth fighting for. Megan smiled to herself as she walked, her heart feeling lighter with each step. Maybe one day everything would truly be okay. Maybe one day they would all be whole again. But for now, Megan was content with the small, quiet victories. She had forgiven, and in doing so, she had freed herself from the chains of anger and resentment that had once bound her. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready to face it. With a heart that was still healing, but no longer afraid to love, she walked on, ready for whatever came next.